The fool stands as one of the most relatable, intriguing, and recurring figures throughout human history. Since time immemorial, fools have surprised and delighted us with their unexpected wisdom and laughter. We celebrate folly by recognizing it in others and in the world around us, and by willingly embracing it within ourselves. This timeless archetype represents an inheritance we all receive at birth, a fundamental aspect of the human experience. Many of us suffer from the absence of the fool in our daily lives. Living frantically and rigidly, we take ourselves far too seriously, striving so desperately to conform to a world that worships productivity, efficiency, and relentless work that we might as well be mechanical cogs in an industrial machine. As William Shakespeare observed, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. When we forget that playfulness represents a basic human need, we wonder why we so easily succumb to boredom and exhaustion, losing our capacity for spontaneity, authenticity, and passion. The remedy for this spiritual malaise lies in giving the fool archetype proper space within our lives. To achieve balance and avoid becoming excessively foolish or irresponsible, we must cultivate the archetype of the sage one who, despite possessing wisdom, recognizes the limits of knowledge and can laugh at himself occasionally. Archetypes function not as parts of a mechanical system, but as pieces of life itself, images integrally connected to the living individual through the bridge of human emotion. The nature of the fool. The character of the fool reveals remarkable complexity, with various characteristics traditionally attributed to this figure. He appears dull-witted, inarticulate, unable to conform to conventional behavioral standards, yet simultaneously possesses natural simplicity and innocence of heart. The etymology of fool traces back to the Latin follis, meaning a pair of bellows expelling empty air. When extended to people, it implies an empty-headed person with insubstantial thoughts. Paradoxically, bellows provide the oxygen necessary for combustion, much as the fool fires us up with inspiration. In 1511, the Dutch scholar Erasmus published In Praise of Folly, which became enormously popular and remains a profoundly penetrating examination of the fool in Western literature. Folly introduces herself in Erasmus's work, and since no one ever praises Folly, she begins by praising herself, arguing that life would prove insufferably dull without her presence. Folly criticizes everyone without reservation, prompting Erasmus's close friends to warn him of the potential dangers of attacking the church. However, even religious figures found the work amusing rather than threatening. Friendship and marriage, Folly observes, contain certain amounts of folly, because we tend to overlook the defects of our friends and loved ones, considering them small vices compared to other people's failings. Intellectuals demonstrate their own form of foolishness in their relentless pursuit of knowledge, spending years frequenting libraries, conducting research, convinced that their work holds tremendous importance, hoping that a few other intellectuals over the span of a century might read their books and think highly of their contributions. Folly compares philosophers to theater critics who unmask the characters on stage and ruin the actors' performances with their pedantic observations. They prove boring and annoying in their relentless analysis. Philosophers seem incapable of understanding how the illusions that help make life bearable serve useful purposes, even when they distort reality. The fool appears infinitely freer and happier than those burdened by the weight of wisdom. They become the life of any gathering. Fools invariably speak the truth because they lack the wisdom necessary to craft lies and manipulate others for personal gain. In essence, nothing can make life happier than the joy that accompanies genuine laughter and play. Folly proves not merely universal, but necessary and even desirable to humanity. To be human means nothing other than to play the fool, and acknowledging this fundamental fact represents the highest form of wisdom, the wise fool paradox. The fool represents a nostalgic return to a simpler way of life, embodying wisdom that springs not from intellectual reasoning but from the heart's understanding. Sometimes the down-to-earth and simple-minded, in their purity of heart, can penetrate to profounder truths than those encumbered with extensive learning and rigid convention, much as we sometimes sense more resonant truth in popular proverbs than in elaborate rational exposition. Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky writes, "The wisest of all, in my opinion, is he who can, if only once a month, call himself a fool, a faculty unheard of nowadays." In literature, wise characters sometimes display apparent insanity, while madmen express profound wisdom. The oxymoron wise fool presents a literal paradox, where the character identified as a fool comes to be regarded as the bearer of true wisdom. People sometimes accuse genuinely wise individuals of insanity to conceal their unwanted wisdom, either fearing harsh truths on controversial topics or simply punishing them for speaking boldly. The archetypal wise fool is Socrates. Not only was his educational method based on exposing the folly of the supposedly wise, but he himself claimed that his wisdom derived from an awareness of his own ignorance. Knowledge of ignorance constitutes itself a kind of knowledge. As Shakespeare writes, "The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool." Two paths lead to being fooled: believing what isn't true and refusing to believe what is true. When uncomfortable truths need speaking and those in power fear to address them, the fool typically steps forward. Something heroic characterizes this intervention. The fool speaks truths nobody else dares utter, bringing instant relief because people recognize these truths must be spoken. Types of fools. Generally speaking, we can distinguish between two types of fools. The natural fool, who lacks social awareness and occasionally utters truth, while remaining unaware of social conventions, and the professional fool, whose job requires making harsh truths more palatable by disguising them with humor and wit. One follows his heart, the other his mind. The greatest fools often prove cleverer than the people who laugh at them. The fool demonstrates fearlessness in speaking truth. In fact, the great secret of the successful fool is that he is no fool at all. As the great English visionary artist William Blake writes, "If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise." The Clown and Trickster. The fool, the clown, and the trickster share similar traits as sources of humor, inevitably eliciting laughter and serving as catalysts for comic catharsis. However, they also express a fundamental duality: folly and non-folly, order and disorder. What appears as mere jest can actually function as warning. Danish theologian and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard writes, "A fire broke out backstage in a theater. The clown came out to warn the public. They thought it was a joke and applauded. He repeated it. The acclaim was even greater. I think that's just how the world will come to an end, to general applause from wits who believe it's a joke." Professional fools can bring essential awareness to current world conditions and future directions. Many of them, however, emerge from places of deep tragedy. The contradictory association between comedy and mental disorders, such as depression and anxiety, is known as the sad clown paradox, where comedy acts as a defense mechanism to suppress feelings of rage and aggression. People may respond with laughter at the clown, yet harbor feelings of pity, fear, or repulsion, evoking profoundly ambivalent reactions. Some people suffer from coulrophobia, the overwhelming fear of clowns. In contemporary culture, clowns frequently appear as sources of horror in books and movies. Perhaps this occurs because the modern clown's role remains invariably the same, entertaining others by becoming the subject of laughter, and he doesn't always succeed at this task. The clown must sacrifice his well-being by constantly maintaining the same face and playing the same character. This one-sidedness exacts a severe mental toll, and the clown slowly becomes consumed by his shadow, the dark side of his personality. The evil clown archetype finds its best portrayal in the Joker, one of popular culture's most recognizable villain characters. In medieval theater, clowns would not only make spectators laugh, but sometimes snatch them away into a hell mouth, the entrance of hell envisioned as a monster's gaping mouth, which terrified audiences. Thus, their light and dark sides remained balanced. Fool versus trickster. The fool and the trickster display several psychological differences. Generally speaking, the fool presents as an innocent or naive figure who wouldn't harm anyone, while the trickster operates with intentional deception, seeking to trick others and laugh at their expense. The trickster delights in what Germans call Schadenfreude, literally harm joy, obtaining pleasure from learning about or witnessing others' misfortunes, failures, or humiliation. A trickster may console others during their failures while internally feeling joy. When opportunities arise to play tricks on others, the trickster immediately seizes them. The fool, however, shows no interest in laughing at people, preferring instead to laugh with them or at himself. Laughing at oneself helps break social ice because it removes not only one's own persona but also the audience's social masks, enabling genuine behavior. This courageous feat places one in a vulnerable state, allowing others to open up and receive messages more profoundly. While the fool enjoys entertaining others and usually becomes the butt of jokes, the trickster seeks primarily to entertain himself, even at others' expense. The fool maintains his sense of humor even in difficult situations, radiating hope to others. In tense atmospheres, the person who suffers takes risks by making jokes, even if it means making a fool of himself, not just to ease his own discomfort, but to bring relief to others. When someone acts foolishly through outward actions, it becomes immediately apparent to observers. With the trickster, behavior remains more ambiguous. He plays the fool to lure people into his traps. The trickster deceives others who never expect to be tricked. Historical and cultural context. In medieval times, the court jester's job involved entertaining the aristocracy through various means: music, storytelling, satire, comedy, juggling, and acrobatics. People believed that keeping a fool on the premises warded off the evil eye. This represents no antiquated superstition, but a psychological truth of enduring value. Usually, it proves wise to place the fool prominently where we can monitor him. We must make room for the renegade factor within ourselves and admit him to our inner court, where he can bring fresh ideas and new energy. Without the fool's blunt observations and playfulness, our inner landscape might become a sterile wasteland. During the Middle Ages, the lower clergy celebrated the Feast of Fools on New Year's Day. To protect society against unexpected uprisings of latent destructive urges, all conventions were temporarily suspended. The natural order reversed completely. Sacred rituals were parodied in obscene fashion, church authorities were ridiculed, and all underdogs were allowed to vent year-long repressions of hostility, lust, and rebellion. These blasphemous celebrations were eventually driven underground by church authorities. The fool also played an important role in royal courts, granted permission by kings to speak truth. Existing simultaneously as both insider and outsider, the fool occupied a peculiar position at court as the one person able to ridicule the very person he served in humor only. Of course, anyone who dares challenge others or the status quo is considered a fool by those too afraid to speak out, who would never risk their reputation by being authentic. To make his special privileges known, the fool imitated the king's crown and scepter with a cap and bells and a bauble, or fool's scepter. In the manner of a ventriloquist's doll, the miniature head of the bauble could say things the jester might prefer not to say himself. Because of their close relationship to the king, jesters were free from punishment and allowed to speak without fear. Nevertheless, some went too far and were beheaded. Fools represent values rejected by groups because they oppose social norms and rules. They are seen as incompetent, frequently ostracized for their rebelliousness, making them social misfits. However, every group must include such figures because they serve as agents of change, and cultural vitality requires space for figures whose function is to uncover and disrupt the very foundations upon which cultures are built. Court jesters usually possessed some form of physical deformity. They came from impoverished families and were financial burdens, but because of their unusual bodies, they were employed as natural fools to create amusement. Deformities were regarded as special marks from the Lord. Therefore, dwarves, hunchbacks, and similar individuals were often chosen as fools in royal households. Dwarves were particularly valued and resided in many royal courts, frequently delivered as gifts between royal family members. They stood next to kings, who then appeared much larger, enhancing their powerful positions. These physically impaired individuals proved to be human beings of unusual depth and wisdom. Excluded by their physical handicaps from average people's activities and interests, their loneliness and suffering forced them to discover internal resources. Literary examples. In Shakespeare's tragedy King Lear, the king's relationship with the fool represents one of friendship and dependency. When left alone with his knights, the king becomes a terribly lonely figure and repeatedly asks where the fool island. The king wants the fool to accompany him everywhere, serving as his alter ego. The fool can be expected to reverse relationships between the dominant and the subservient, as he occupies the paradoxical position of virtual outlawry combined with utter dependence on support from the social group to which he belongs. Shakespearean fools, like the fools and jesters of their time, used their wits to outdo people of higher social standing, though their characteristics are exaggerated for theatrical effect. The Parsifal Legend. The myth of Parsifal, an ancient Arthurian legend, describes the journey a boy must undertake to become a man. Known as Parsifal, young fool, he lives alone with his mother. After witnessing knights pass by, he becomes marveled and decides to leave his mother to become a knight himself, undergoing many trials that initiate him into manhood. In the story, the Grail Castle faces serious trouble. The Fisher King, the castle's ruler, has been wounded so severely that he cannot live, yet remains incapable of dying. He is rendered infertile and his kingdom has become barren. This expresses how psychological wounds manifest as problems in the external world. Every adolescent receives his Fisher King wound, the graduation from naive consciousness into self-consciousness. It proves painful to watch adolescents grow up and realize that the world contains more than joy and happiness. However, this first contact with wounding becomes what later enables redemption in life. Every night, a solemn ceremony occurs in the Grail Castle. One maiden holds the Holy Grail, filled with wine, and each person who drinks from it receives their deepest wish. The Fisher King, however, does not participate and suffers alone. No further outward effort becomes possible when our inward capacity is wounded. This perhaps represents the deepest form of suffering, being directly in front of beauty, happiness, and holiness, yet unable to partake in any of it. The court fool had prophesied long ago that the Fisher King would be healed when an innocent fool arrived at court and asked a specific question. One day, Parsifal discovers a man fishing on a lake, the Fisher King. He asks if there's any place to stay the night, and the Fisher King gives him directions to the Grail Castle. Parsifal attends the ceremony, but the Fisher King groans in agony alone. The young fool, who refused to remove the homespun garment made by his mother, remembers her advice not to ask too many questions, symbolizing a mother complex. He forgets what he learned from the godfather figure who trained him and does not speak to the Fisher King. The following day, he leaves the castle. When he turns around, the castle has vanished. It took Parsifal 20 long and painful years to find the Grail Castle again. The original myth ends here. The inner castle always exists, but appears invisible to our eyes unless we see the world with fresh vision. Many continued stories relate that after Parsifal revisited the Grail castle, he asked the Fisher King, "Whom does the Grail serve?" Immediately, the king was healed, and peace and happiness reigned over the land. The Grail represents the center of meaning in human life, and life's meaning is to serve the Grail or higher self. Jungian analyst Robert A. Johnson writes, "A man must consent to look to a foolish, innocent, adolescent part of himself for his cure. The inner fool is the only one who can touch his Fisher King wound." Don Quixote. In Don Quixote, often considered the first modern novel, Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes portrays a man driven mad after reading numerous books of chivalry. He decides to become a knight-errant under the name Don Quixote. Riding his weak horse, he sets out to defend the innocent and defeat the wicked, only to accomplish exactly the opposite. All this he does in the name of a peasant woman whom he idealizes as a princess but who remains unseen throughout the novel. The term quixotic refers to someone apt to be deluded, unable to distinguish reality from imagination, pursuing lofty and romantic ideals that are impractical. In a famous scene, the hero engages in an imaginary fight with windmills, believing them to be giants. This originates the idiom tilting at windmills, attacking imaginary enemies. Don Quixote recruits Sancho Panza as his sidekick and squire a down-to-earth peasant puzzled by his master's grandiose fantasies, but, being promised great wealth, follows him riding a donkey. Sancho's realism contrasts sharply with his master's idealism. Don Quixote's good intentions, however, end up harming those he encounters. Since he remains largely unable to see the world as it truly is, he is viewed not only as a fool, but as a complete madman. Despite his insanity, he demonstrates wit and occasional apparent sanity, so long as he avoids the topic of chivalry. This may warn that even the most intelligent people can fall victim to their own foolishness. At the end, Don Quixote becomes sick and falls asleep, later awakening from both his dream and his madness. He realizes he has wasted his life and recognizes his craziness. The novel's atmosphere shifts from comedy to tragedy, and people who previously viewed him with scorn cannot help but feel pity for him. They insist he is wrong and that he truly is a knight. What was previously viewed as insanity is now considered sanity. After his life-giving illusions dissipate, he dies from an overdose of reality. This raises the question, is it better to know the truth and be unhappy, or live in a fool's paradise? The Idiot. In his novel The Idiot, Dostoevsky explores this question extensively. He portrays the ideal man, a positively beautiful individual, in a morally corrupted and decayed world. The protagonist, Prince Myshkin, returns to Russia after spending time in a Swiss sanatorium, receiving treatment for epilepsy and idiocy until the 20th century, an actual medical term for neurological disorders. Starting with a train ride to St. Petersburg, he is thrust headfirst into society's corruption. The character appears different from other virtuous fools in fiction by emphasizing innocence rather than comedy. Dostoevsky writes, "First of all, this prince is an idiot, and, secondly, he is a fool, knows nothing of the world, and has no place in it." Myshkin's open-heartedness, innocence, and lack of social experience serve as instruments of satire, standing in sharp contrast to the corrupted, cold, money-hungry, manipulative, and egocentric society he encounters. The prince is frank, open, and unable to hide his true feelings behind a persona to impress others. He speaks his mind regardless of social settings. This leads people to call him an idiot, even though he possesses deep insights about human nature and what it means to be a true Christian. The antithesis of Myshkin is Hippolyte, a young atheist and nihilist in tuberculosis's final stages, near death. He loses his will to live and rebels against society, nature, and God, famously stating, "It is better to be unhappy and know the worst than to be happy in a fool's paradise." Prince Myshkin, conversely, does not understand why someone would choose unhappiness. Instead of philosophizing, the prince spends considerable time with sinners, serving as their moral and spiritual guide. Small acts of kindness truly matter in the world. Redemption represents a key theme in the novel, saving the soul from sinfulness through humility and compassion. In the book's most popular line, Dostoevsky writes, "The prince assures us that beauty will save the world." Fairy tales and folklore. In many fairy tales, we encounter three brothers, the youngest being a simpleton whom everybody mocks, but it is always this fool who becomes the story's hero. He is the foolhardy brother who rushes in where angels fear to tread, and by doing so wins the princess's hand and her kingdom. The fool seems to possess magical powers and has Lady Luck on his side. His spontaneous approach to life combines wisdom, madness, and folly. When he mixes these ingredients in proper proportions, the results prove miraculous. But when one-sidedness occurs, everything can end up in a sticky mess. One of Russian folklore's most beloved figures is Ivan the Fool. Russian writer Leo Tolstoy wrote a story titled Ivan the Fool, alluding to this character. In the story, Ivan is the youngest and third son in a peasant family. He is taken advantage of because of his naivety, kindness, and capacity to easily forgive others, even at his own expense. His brothers are tempted by money and military power. However, Ivan lives simply. He lives on a farm, caring for his old father and mute sister, working in the fields. When the two brothers run out of money, they insist on receiving their share of their father's wealth. The father objects because Ivan and his sister have helped him. Ivan, however, agrees to his brother's demands. The old devil, seeing Ivan's generosity and lack of conflict between the brothers, sends a little devil to each brother to start a feud. The two devils succeed in tempting the brothers with greed and power, and they encounter trouble. Ivan, who is stricken with illness by the devil, only works harder and overcomes all obstacles. The three little devils collaborate to defeat Ivan, but they all fail. As Ivan finds each devil individually, they beg for their lives and promise to grant him any wish if he spares them. Ivan innocently utters, "God bless you," which makes them vanish. He can make gold from leaves and soldiers from straw, and decides to give the gold coins to village peasants and conjure soldiers to sing and dance. Finally, the old devil loses patience and goes to Ivan, but is also defeated. While Ivan relies on his heart and believes in legends and mythical beliefs, the brothers focus on their minds and practicality. Ivan ends up marrying the Tsar's daughter. The man who has nothing receives everything. The fool becomes the hero. The Tarot Fool. In tarot, the fool is commonly depicted as a man holding a white rose, symbolizing innocence and purity, and a small bundle of possessions in the other hand. He willingly sacrifices everything for the journey. He walks merrily, looking up at the sky, living in a fool's paradise, absorbed in all the great adventures awaiting him, while at his heels, a dog tries to draw his attention because he is about to fall off a cliff. Tarot derives from 15th century Italian illustrated playing cards known as triumphi, inspired by theatrical festivals and used for entertainment. They were later called tarocchi, from which tarot derives, and whose root tarot translates to foolishness. Therefore, tarot is also called the Fool's Journey. In the 18th century, the occult practice of cartomancy began rising to prominence, and mystics referred to the 78 cards as arcana. The first 22 constitute the major arcana, and the remaining 56 the minor arcana. The Fool has the number 0, and in most decks represents the first of the 22 major arcana cards, the last of which is the World. In the final card, there is a large laurel wreath symbolizing wholeness, in which the Fool, who is androgynous, becomes the cosmic dancer and the anima mundi, world soul. However, just as the journey toward wholeness ends, it begins anew, for it represents a lifelong process. The Fool is both the beginning and the end of the journey. He is heroic because he leaps from the place of comfort into the realm of the unknown. The fool's journey resembles the monomyth of the hero's journey, in which the hero receives a call to adventure and must leave the safety and comfort of the ordinary world to enter the unknown and difficult territory of the special world. Here he must defeat his dragon, worst fear, event, person, or memory long avoided, and gather the gold, the treasure hard to attain. The journey represents a psychological and spiritual death and rebirth, in which an old aspect of oneself dies, giving birth to a new and more capable self. Finally, the hero must return to his people in the ordinary world and share the gift acquired in the special world with others, something with the power to heal, whether wisdom, love, or simply the experience of surviving the special world. The fool is a wanderer, energetic, ubiquitous, and immortal. He is the most powerful of all tarot trumps. The fool exists always in a process of becoming and is considered the initiation into life's great mystery. The major arcana can be viewed as pictures representing typical experiences encountered along the age-old path to self-realization, or what Swiss psychiatrist and psychologist Carl Jung called individuation. Tarot cards can be used for amplification, a Jungian method allowing one to clarify obscure dreams, visions, drawings, or other fantasy material by turning up the volume of images through comparative study of mythology, religion, alchemy, fairy tales, and art. The symbolism of zero. It is appropriate that the fool bears the number 0. Zero's power is inherent in its circular form, which symbolizes infinity. The ancient Egyptian symbol of the Ouroboros or tail devourer represents the concept of endless return and eternity associated with the maxim, one is all, and all is one. It is the pleroma, the fullness of being where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. As many sages have observed, God is an infinite sphere, the center of which is everywhere, the circumference nowhere. A circle with a dot at its center is the universal sign for the sun, source of all warmth, light, and power. This hieroglyph also represents the world egg, from whose fertile center all creation arose and continues to arise, and relates to paradise, that blissful state of unconscious nature which humanity experienced before falling into the reality of consciousness. It is the primeval womb where we all lived once upon a time outside space and time. The nostalgia we feel for childhood reflects this great longing to be contained once more in the perfect circle, the original state of wholeness, where the union of opposites is attained. In Jungian psychology, the dot represents the ego, the center of consciousness, and the circle represents the self, the center of the entire psyche, which embraces both consciousness and the unconscious. Jung writes, "It is not I who create myself, rather I happen to myself." Historical evolution of the fool image. The imagery of the fool, who lives on today in our playing cards disguised as the Joker, has undergone many symbolic transformations, alternating between beggar, madman, and fool. The Visconti Sforza tarot, dating from the 15th century, are believed to be the oldest surviving cards, though no complete deck has survived. Here, the fool is depicted as a beggar or vagabond, wearing ragged clothes and stockings without shoes. He carries a stick and has feathers in his hair, which may relate to the notion of the wild man. In the Solarbuska Tarot, created by an unknown artist in the late 15th century, the fool has a feathered headdress and plays a bagpipe. In the German Hofamterspiel of the 15th century, the fool, Narr, also plays a bagpipe but is barefooted, wears a robe and bells on his hood, reminiscent of the court jester. In the Mantegna Tarocchi from the same century, the fool is portrayed as a semi-naked old man leaning on a staff, with the word misero, beggar, inscribed. In this card, we see an animal trying to grab his attention. The fool is in such close contact with his instinctual side that he does not need to look where he is going in the literal sense. His animal nature guides his steps. In an old French tarot card, the fool appears blindfolded, further emphasizing his ability to act by insight rather than eyesight, using intuitive wisdom instead of conventional logic. In an old Swiss card, the fool has a full jester outfit and holds a wand. In subsequent card decks, such as in the Tarot of Marseilles, popular during the 17th and 18th centuries, the fool wears a jester hat, carries a bundle of belongings on a stick over his back, and is chased by an animal who has torn his pants or is happily following a butterfly. Finally, we have the popular image of the fool who is about to fall off a cliff, used in the Rider-Waite Tarot deck published in 1909 by the Rider Company, illustrated by Pamela Colman Smith, and based on the instructions of British poet and mystic Arthur Edward Waite, both members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Psychological implications. Psychologically, the archetype of the fool serves as the precursor to transformation, representing a new beginning. Nothing would start without the fool. Inventors and geniuses have almost always been regarded as no better than fools, at the beginning of their career, and very frequently at the end of it also. Shoshin is a Zen Buddhist concept meaning beginner's mind, which opposes close-mindedness and thinking oneself an expert. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. Open-mindedness can lead to cultivating silence, which provides necessary space for the mysterious experience of the numinous. If you can't listen to what someone next to you is saying, you won't hear the voice of silence. The potential of our five senses is vast, but they are limited by our lack of refinement. Jung writes, "The soul demands your folly, not your wisdom." To embark on a journey of self-discovery is traditionally considered foolish. We are supposed to follow a linear path: education, work, marriage, and so on. When a person deviates from this path, he is seen as a fool whose adventures will amount to nothing but poverty and misery. The first step is usually the hardest and most important. As the Chinese proverb states, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The fool thinks of all the wonderful adventures that lie ahead and worries less about making mistakes. He thinks on his feet, remains energetic, and urges us to live life to the fullest, while the person who thinks too much becomes overcautious and remains stagnant. It is the fear of uncertainty that frightens many of us to the point of paralysis. To avoid suffering from anticipation, we would rather experience failure and sacrifice success. This state of rumination and overthinking creates anxiety, and one suffers more in imagination than in reality. Failure, however, can open new doors that one never imagined or expected to be open. What we think of abstractly as absolute failure may actually lead to unimaginable success. As the alchemists say, in filth it will be found. What you need most is to be found where you least wish to look. The fool usually has no idea what he is getting into by starting a new journey and does not see all the trials he must overcome, which might have prevented him from going on the journey in the first place. The fool lives in the moment and sees reality as its island. He is not afraid of change and exploring unknown territory, despite being warned of its dangers. No matter how many times he stumbles, the fool keeps going. No great person has ever avoided making mistakes. In the end, it is the journey that matters, not the destination. We shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. The shadow of the fool. While the fool possesses many positive aspects, he can also become so stubborn that he does not take a moment to step back and reflect, to look where he is headed, so he falls off a cliff. The fool stands on the edge. Sometimes our inner intuitive voice of protection becomes judgmental and self-perpetuating. The voice that warns, "Be careful, you will make a fool of yourself." That is a dumb question. Everyone is going to laugh at you and judge you. You sound ridiculous. This is the voice of conformity and the dark side of the fool. It is the voice that causes you to dumb down and play it safe, to be content with superficial pleasures and safety, and strive for other people's acceptance to the detriment of your true desires. This happens when we are unconscious of the fool within us, which leads to jealousy, resentment, shame, and other neuroses. In his relationship to the journey toward individuation, the fool demonstrates both the initiative and the resistance inherent in his nature. He is closely tied to the archetype of eternal youth, which we all possess after growing up from childhood. It can bring the energy, beauty, and creativity of childhood into adult life, or thwart self-realization and doom us to both unrealistic adolescent fantasies and experiencing life as a prison. The fool is closely related to the child archetype. Children have less of a persona and follow their instinct rather than what others tell them to do, the Freudian superego. The child has half entered the rational world, and the madman has half escaped from it, for these two are, in some measure, released from the remorseless pressure of daily events, the ceaseless impact of external senses, which burden the rest of mankind. The fool embodies a light-hearted optimism that refuses to take life too seriously. This playful approach to existence connects directly to what Friedrich Nietzsche observed, man's maturity, to have regained the seriousness that he had as a child at play. True wisdom, paradoxically, lies in recovering the earnest joy we possessed as children, when play itself was the most serious business of all. The psychological foundation of the fool. Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz provides crucial insight by linking the fool to what Jung termed the inferior function, the least developed aspect of our psychological makeup. In Jung's framework of 4 basic functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, each person naturally develops one primary function, while leaving others relatively undeveloped. A predominantly thinking person, for instance, typically struggles most with feeling-based decisions. This underdeveloped area becomes their inferior function. Yet von Franz recognizes that the fool transcends this simple psychological categorization. The fool represents something far more profound, an archetypal religious figure who embodies a part of the human personality or even of humanity, which remained behind and therefore still has the original wholeness of nature. When mythological stories feature the fool as the 4th member of a group, we witness the inferior function in action, that awkward, seemingly inadequate part of ourselves that paradoxically holds the key to our completeness. This psychological insight reveals the fool's deeper purpose. Rather than merely representing our weakest traits, the fool hero embodies those despised, ridiculous, and seemingly maladapted aspects of personality that we typically try to suppress. Yet these very qualities serve as our bridge to the unconscious realm. The fool stands as a gatekeeper between 2 distinct worlds, the familiar territory of daily consciousness and the mysterious landscape of imagination and dreams. Through this liminal position, he offers access to what Jung called the treasure hard to attain, the integration of our full psychological potential. Ultimately, it is precisely this inferior function that holds the power to heal our deepest spiritual wounds, including that Fisher King wound we all carry, the sacred dimension, the holy fool. The concept of the holy fool elevates this archetype from mere psychological curiosity to spiritual necessity. The holy fool demonstrates supreme courage by willingly accepting ridicule, scorn, and social rejection in service of truth and love. This figure possesses an unshakable integrity that manifests as the radical courage to remain authentic regardless of circumstances or social pressure. Unlike those who shape their identity based on others' reactions or conform out of fear, the holy fool maintains complete independence from conventional judgment systems. This freedom allows him to be fully present with other human beings without the filters of social expectation or prejudice. Such radical authenticity makes the holy fool perhaps the most dangerous figure to established power structures. Authorities and ruling systems depend on people's willingness to compromise their truth for social acceptance or material security. The holy fool threatens this dynamic by demonstrating that individual worth stems from divine love rather than social approval, suggesting that every person possesses unlimited spiritual potential, regardless of their position in worldly hierarchies. This understanding connects directly to the Christian tradition of being a fool for Christ's sake, rooted in St. Paul's revolutionary claim that divine wisdom appears as foolishness to worldly eyes. Paul observed that those who profess themselves to be wise in worldly terms often become the greatest fools, spiritually speaking. The path of Christian foolishness involves deliberately rejecting material accumulation and social status in favor of spiritual development, accepting that such choices may result in public humiliation and mockery. In this framework, the fool serves as herald to the Savior, preparing hearts for truths that conventional wisdom cannot grasp. As Paul urged, "Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seemeth to be wise in this world, let him become a fool, that he may be wise."